What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Hey everybody, this is Charles Figley and my colleague
Mark Russell here for Psychiatric Casualties.
and we will have guests, we promise. Not this week. Kathy was going to join us, but she got caught up on a number of other things. So it's just the two of us. And yeah, so we're focusing on 16 and we left off, let's see, psychiatric screening, rejection, and more screening. That was the title within the book that we focused on that.
Yeah, the purging of weakness.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And you point out that I think it's on page 161, Union Army Surgeon General Hammond implemented a higher age requirement.
Yep.
I think you did touch on that last issue.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, he changed the age for the Union Army to 22 because there was a concern about predisposition for people of younger years in their teens as being more predisposed to psychiatric breakdown. So he tried to up that to 22 years. We don't know if that policy stayed in effect throughout the American Civil War. This is 1862 when he advocated that policy, but it was kind of the first known psychiatric screening, done by the military in order to purge some type of weakness or predisposition to a war stress injury.
And what about 1918? Followed Solomon's recommendation. Do you recall that?
Yeah. So that Colonel Solomon again was the American neuropsychiatric chief that was appointed to develop the American military's programs to prevent widespread psychiatric casualties and attrition and pensions that were happening across the European theater, and in preparation for the Americans' entry into the First World War, which was the last 6 months in 1918, which was, the end of the First World War. And so he had some, recommendations, frontline psychiatry being one, trying to avoid psychiatric diagnosis that would give people an honorable out, reducing the amount of eligibility for disability pensions, and then the psychiatric screenings that they developed. The first, what we call now IQ tests, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta test, and the first personality test, the Woodworth Personality Inventory, and all. They, I think, screened out, rejected over 70,000 predisposed recruits, candidates, yet still had about 70,000 psychiatric disabilities and $1 billion in disability pension for psychiatric reasons.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then we doubled down.
Yeah.
Second World War.
Worse. Yeah. Pretty bad. Yeah. So we talked about the interwar years as well, but let's go to purging weakness, the protective benefit. You recall that? At page 164.
Let's see.
That's going into the first section.
I'm trying to think of what we were talking about protective benefit for the military.
Yeah.
The protective benefit would be to reject weakness. That would include the dismantling of all the mental health programs in the military that were promulgated in the First World War to reduce psychiatric attrition. And then the interwar years, they decided to disband all the negative influences, the corruptibility of psychiatry. So I got rid of that, as well as rejected, we said, about 2 million American volunteers at the outset of the Second World War.
As the war went on, oh my goodness, who's going to fight this war? So
Well, yeah, that was exactly what FDR and the head of the War Department were saying too, because by 1943 we were had more psychiatric discharges in the Army than we did accessions. So it was outstripping the pace of replacement and caused a real existential dilemma. What are we doing? We don't have psychiatrists out there. We screen out for every known predisposition and weakness, and we rejected over 2 million, 3 million altogether from coming in the military, yet we still are having this, epidemic of psychiatric casualties. What do we do? And that's when they reversed their policies and reconstituted the mental health programs and then relaxed some of the psychiatric screening rejections so they could get more people in.
That must have been a real struggle to reverse direction and then discover, oh, wait,
Yeah,
this has happened over time. Since the Civil War, there's been changes.
And well, even the lessons of the First World War was that the psychiatric screenings were not successful, and that it was the effects of war itself that was primarily responsible for the increase in psychiatric casualties. But yet all the studies done after the First World War pointed to everything other than the war itself, right? Poor leadership, poor unit cohesion, too many predisposed weaknesses, and we got that damn psychiatry and mental health that's mucking things up and giving people honorable discharges for feigning some type of fake illness. So we're going to get rid of all that, and then we're going to fight a war with real men and real women who are hardy and strong, the Captain Americas, right? We're going to have the super soldiers. So the most ambitious screening ever done, undertaken, we had the most resilient, most hardy, psychologically hardy military known to man. And then yet psychiatric casualties, as we talked about, outpaced the total number of medically and wounded and those killed in war combined.
That's right. Yeah.
I want to make a correction though, Charles. I think I said last episode too that in 1942 during the Battle of Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division had 60% of their evacuees were for psychiatric reasons. I need to correct that. It was actually 40%. Still a pretty sizable number, particularly given that that's 40% of Marines who had psychiatric breakdowns who were screened into the military who did not have any predispositions. And that's without psychiatry being present. So it wasn't they were coddled or they were, given a diagnosis and, by a psychiatrist that allowed them to escape their duty, any of that stuff, right? This is the doubling down of the purging of weakness, yet 40% of Marines in Guadalcanal succumb to some type of war stress injury.
Bad. I was looking at some of the notes that I took. We talked about special forces, and there was I think you discovered that. Could you tell that again? Because I think that's very, very important. Most people, perceive special forces as those that have gotten rid of anyone in special forces that would have any kinds of problems or difficulties. You know how that works out in the other branches.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. What about that?
Well, again, you can draw the lessons from the First World War was that high unit cohesion, high morale, physical and psychological hardiness, intelligence are all protective factors.
Buffers, yeah.
Buffers to prevent people from developing psychiatric conditions, right? So we think of special forces and, most of us have, kind of these are the super soldiers, right? These people have extra hard trainings. They're super high morale. They got generally the best leadership, high cohesion in the unit. And it's believed, and this is a lot from my generation in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, that special forces had been more or less immune from psychiatric breakdown compared to the regular Army, the regular Marine Corps, etc. And the studies that were conducted seemed to support some of that. They had lower psychiatric attrition, lower rates of psychiatric disability, etc. When they did an anonymous survey where people could speak their mind and not worry about, the stigma of mental health or losing their special forces badges, those researchers said or found that their rates of PTSD were higher than that of the regular Army. It was like 16 to 20% special Army special forces in this one study. And special forces have been overused by everyone's, metric that they have been, especially in this war on terror. It's the special forces who have taken the brunt and have more deployments, more exposure to traumatic stressors. And yet, even when you do the right research and you control for stigma and reprisal and provide some anonymous responses, you get what the Israeli self-defense forces call hidden PTSD, which is they had it, but just didn't disclose it for reasons that, again, the stigma and their career reprisals. But yeah, so the idea of a super soldier being immune from traumatic stress exposures, the cumulative effects of war stress has always been folly, and is even so even amongst our most elite of forces.
We have been talking here and we've written about it, etc. The breakdown. Eventually, I think, let's see, what was it? For those that have no experience, that are, rookies, although they went through boot camp, there's a certain amount of time before they break down. It's longer for combat, old sergeants. Those that have had a lot of experience, it's much further.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I'm just wondering what the heck is happening in Israel with the amount of fighting that they're doing.
Yeah.
And the sustained, the amount of time that they've been doing this for a long time, and the intensity has increased as well. And there's no reports on morale or any kind of feedback about how the troops there are doing. What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, nothing in real time. When we started after the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq in 2003, the U.S. Army did some real-time studies tracking mental health, prevalence of mental health conditions after people returned from deployments. And that was one of the first real-time studies. This was done during the war, not, a post-war analysis like most of the research has been done throughout the ages. And I think the Israeli self-defense forces are going through the same thing. I have not seen anything published yet about what are the rates of psychiatric casualties or disabilities from it. So they're not following the American Army's lead in far as real time. And the exposures, yeah, it's the combat, but it's also seeing the effects of collateral damage, women and children being killed or maimed in large numbers, and seen buddies killed and seriously injured, etc. So, excuse me, I would expect the rates would be as high as they would be in any intense combat. And
all the reasons we've talked about.
All the reasons we talk about.
Yeah.
So if you have 16 to 20% of American special forces who have so-called hidden PTSD, you would expect something similar probably in Israeli self-defense forces, probably even higher.
When I very early on, I think it was like 1990, maybe, probably before that, in which I met Solomon.
Right, yeah.
Why am I blocking on her first name? Zahava?
Zahava.
Yeah, Zahava. And she was talking about some of the early research that she had done in terms of understanding what's happening with military families.
Yes.
The challenges and difficulties they had. And that was among the first time that I saw that there were differences. So they were reporting it, I think, fairly straightforward without holding back on anything. And it seemed like those that were professional military personnel and their families were different than those that were not, because everyone had to serve in the military.
Right. Yeah, they have that.
but it's interesting the complexity of the disorder when it's in the context of the system of within the family, because you have like Zahaba, she experienced these things without going into combat, although she was in the military when they were both in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there is so much more that we can learn just by following the trauma, by following what you're saying and what we've written about, the challenge of what you need to avoid and what you can avoid and what impact that has.
Yeah.
And it's again what you were describing: injuries, horrible wounds, children being mixed up in the challenges.
Which
I've always been impressed with that phenomenon of Israelis and colleagues of mine who are doing this stuff that nearly always they're ahead of us. and they are, I mean, they're doing their best and they're following whatever dictation or whatever requirements, but nonetheless, they were finding far more difficulties than I've heard described among American families. And I know that's not the case. I think both families or both nations are suffering.
Oh, no question. And, you know, the Israelis have, in the self-defense forces, have taken the lead when it comes to doing research, like on the frontline psychiatry policies that they have borrowed from the West and they have modified, but it's the same kind of 100-year policy that we'll talk about in other episodes more in detail what that is and the effects that has on individuals, the cumulative effects it has on the soldier and their families. And all that research that we cite comes out of the Israel experiences, because you won't find very much of that in the American or the Western militaries. But yeah, the positive benefit to the military is like, and why you probably don't see or hear about in the Israel experience, real-time studies about, you know, the prevalence of PTSD or suicide or anything like that, is what would that do for the morale of the units if that was published? You know, looking at it from the perspective of the military leaders, the military planners, the government leaders who are trying to promulgating the war and have reasons for that people can have one view or the other on that, but that there's a real benefit from squelching that information from getting out, right? It's just going to draw more attention to the reasons not to have the war and to end the war. So the government will not probably be the ones who initiate research studies to see, well, how are our troops and their families dealing with the effects of this war psychiatrically? And that's,
yeah, I'd like to know what kind of pushback the military provides, at least in Israel, when these various kinds of studies are even proposed, because it seems like there are those that work on military affairs, military issues, are connected in various ways. They're veterans, you know, maybe a career in the military, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just wondering how that would work out.
yeah,
Especially with this war, especially with the one that's being fought now. I mean, it's so horrific and terrible. And many of my friends in Israel, they believe they feel the same way. They wish, you know, there was another reality.
yeah. Well, the reality of war is that it's ugly and often traumatic and any number of ways. And if you're a government or you're the military, you're trying to, and your mission is to win and fight the wars. We talked about the military's dual mission, right? To fight and win wars, but the second mission in the military is to force health protection, right? That the first mission is often the primary and sometimes the only one, except maybe for the physical needs and the dental needs soldiers as far as force health protection, but the mental health part of that force health protection is rarely given any priority. And that I wouldn't be surprised that be true in the Israel as it was in the US. You know, something I wanted to go back to, this one thing is sticking in my head when we talked about the Second World War and the doubling down of psychiatric screenings.
Yes.
Unprecedented mass screenings and purging of weakness of any kind, yet resulted in more psychiatric casualties than, as we said, medically wounded and those killed in action. Well, one of the things I didn't mention was that the Army went back and did studies on people who they had previously rejected because they had some type of predisposed weakness. And they followed it, and they allowed them to come in the military. They screened them in, and they followed them. This was the research studies. There's two separate studies that I'm familiar with. And both studies found that over 80% of those who were not killed in action, remained on active duty several years after they entered the military, despite whatever predispositions they may have had that led to their initial rejection. There was no difference in the groups of those who were initially rejected and then brought in, and those who were deemed as psychologically hardy without predispositions. They compared these groups. No difference in awards for heroism. No difference in terms of length of duty, right? Sustainability. So again, another knock on the head against this whole trauma pension debate, that it's all about predisposition and weakness is the primary explanation for why somebody might develop a war stress injury and not the war itself, which the overwhelming research that we haven't talked about yet, like for PTSD, for example, and they look at what causes PTSD, the overwhelming conclusions are that it's exposure to traumatic stress, and it's the cumulative often exposure that leads to breakdown, even amongst those old surgeons.
Let me just jump to something that is consistent with this, but in terms of, so we know that it's combat, we know that it's the environmental stressors that account for why people are that way.
Right.
Any guess what country leads us? If it's not Israel, is there like Great Britain or Canada or something? Is there anyone? I mean, I know that we've talked about the possibility of, a book that with chapters from different countries, but what do you think we would find? We look there.
Well, you mentioned it. It was the United Kingdom has probably done more of the work on,
because they were forced to, because
they were forced to. They were sued into submission.
Sued into submission.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in future episodes too. But basically, it was a class action suit that allowed service members and their family to sue the Ministry of Defense, which is the Department of Defense equivalency, and resulted in them changing their deployment guidelines and how much exposure were people given, the length of deployment and the amount of combat exposure, and the amount of dwell time when you come back that you needed to have before you could be redeployed. And see, one of the problems for the Americans is in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq was that people were deployed and for 6 months to 18 months, and then sometimes stayed even longer due to policies that forbade them from being discharged. And then they would transfer to another unit, and then that unit was going to deploy, and there was nothing that says, okay, you just got back from deployment, so people would go back on another deployment, and them and their families had to live through that as well. So the Harmony guidelines that the UK adopted were to stringently monitor the amount of combat exposure because, well, that's the one robust causative factor, etiological factor that the science has shown is consistent, and that is what predicts PTSD is the amount of exposure to traumatic events, traumatic stressors, above and beyond anything else, including any predisposition weakness that World War II should have taught us is not a valid explanation. Not that predispositions aren't something that can contribute, but it overwhelmingly is not predispositions, it's the exposure to potentially traumatic stressors and chronic stress that causes breakdown.
And it's not really accurate to simplify just simply saying fear. It's beyond fear.
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, as you could attest to, having been in Vietnam, that fear itself is pretty universal. It's the rare person who doesn't experience fear, and usually there's something else going on, that there's not a fear. It's be able to ride through the fear and continue to fight despite the fear. That's where certainly unit cohesion and morale and leadership can have a real effect on that as well.
But I'm pretty sure I saw in my notes of that chapter, of the chapter we're focusing on, is that isn't necessarily the case. Do you know what I'm saying? And that
Sure.
the things that you identified, there was one that, do you recall what you just said?
What I just said?
Again.
Heck no.
Like there were 3 factors or 3 elements to it.
To what causes?
That enables you to avoid it, enables you to deal with it more effectively.
Oh, well, like denial? Was that what we were talking about last episode or
No,
episodes back?
it doesn't matter.
I'm so sorry. I'm not.
No, I normally write things down immediately because of this disability, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this is related to, but after Vietnam, there was the National Vietnam Readjustment Study.
Mm-hmm.
I think you had some role in that, did you
I
not?
was part of the committee. Yeah.
You're part of that committee.
Yeah.
What were you guys looking at?
Boy, I don't remember. So
Right.
long ago. But I think we were looking at all of the various things that were perceived to be factors, and there were a number of us. There were a lot of people that had the same kind of perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and we were in the majority there, so it worked out pretty well.
Yeah,
What
and
were you thinking that we would be doing at that time?
well, I think the focus was, my understanding was on PTSD, and was trying to answer the question that, what was the high prevalence of PTSD diagnosis amongst Vietnam veterans? And PTSD itself wasn't adopted until 1980
Right.
in DSM-3, but that a lot of Vietnam veterans came back, and while they were in theater, the Army had declared a victory over psychiatric disabilities. And then when Vietnam veterans came back, it was this almost an epidemic of PTSD and suicides and all the things that we see after these recent wars. And it caused a big flurry in the media and the government and amongst the military and VA about, was this PTSD legitimate? Again, a newly adopted diagnosis, and now we got all these veterans coming back who are being diagnosed with PTSD, and that what is the cause of that? What causes PTSD? What would explain this explosion of PTSD amongst veterans? And here's a quote from the conclusion of that study. It says, taken together, these results are consistent with the model of PTSD that posits a role for individual vulnerability, potentially including biological, psychological, and social demographic factors, specifically war zone stressors, in determining who among theater veterans gets PTSD. However, this is still the quote, it is clear that exposure to war zone stress makes a substantial contribution to the development of PTSD in war veterans that is independent of a broad range of potential predisposing factors.
Independent, yeah.
Independent. Because the argument, again, in keeping with the trauma pension debates, was the naysayers was saying these people were predisposed to begin with when they deployed to Vietnam, or they're being influenced morally by these anti-war psychiatrists, and that it's not had nothing to do with Vietnam or the war stress that they were exposed to. It had more to do with these predisposing factors and social factors.
Yeah, that was discussed to a certain extent, as I recall, barely, and it was more of an insult for those of us who were in combat and certainly I was not someone that, I mean, there are a lot of people that had more combat than I had, but they were clear about what they believed were the realities of it, especially since we had reviewed so much. And I think that there was a certain degree of intimidation by those people who did not agree that it was the war that caused the disability or the challenge.
Mm.
You know, the thing that I've found is that I don't know if this has ever been studied, it should be, I guess, is that time heals not all wounds, but it heals some wounds.
Yeah, there's some terms like spontaneous recovery or something, right? Or remission, or
Well, I don't think it's spontaneous. I think that you just go through a lot. I mean, you heard me talk about some of the things that I've experienced, all post-traumatic. It's all after the war,
right.
And thinking about the war, reframing things, and recognizing, of course, you feel this way. There's no action now. How are you feeling? I mean, it's for me, it wasn't a sudden thing. It wasn't just overnight. Actually, much of it was associated with when I started interviewing combat vets for understanding, for helping counselors more effectively deal with it. And yeah, it was a very gradual sort of thing for me. And now, have you experienced PTSD yourself?
Yeah, I would say I have certainly. A lot of that is
Secondary, right?
secondary or
Yeah.
vicarious, but some of it's primary as well.
It's still real,
Oh, it's
no matter what.
it's very well. Yeah, and it's and usually, as you'll hear from a lot of veterans too, it's not one event; it's a cumulative effects, right? So, and that certainly would be true in my case. It's just a variety of sources, and some of that had to do with war, and some of it was not war related, but still traumatic and had an influence. And so, but the struggles I think most of us have, and amongst us mental health providers, but also certainly individual service members and their families, is that there's a large pushback on that a counter message that PTSD is not a legitimate injury that's attributed to life experiences, but that it's more, again, predisposed, and we were kind of weak to begin with, or that we're being influenced by the culture of trauma. As
Yeah, I have not, and maybe it's the circles I run into, but in going to all kinds of conferences, I counted the number of presentations of at conferences, etc. And I haven't, I rarely hear of that argument, in terms of who PTSD. Now, it may be because they don't want to insult me. I don't know.
Yeah,
It seems like it's a very common and acceptable problem that practitioners are effectively working on, and the naysayers are few and far between. I know that they exist, and I know that they end up writing papers and responses to papers, but it seems like you've experienced another group, another perspective.
I have talked to leaders, high ranking military psychiatrists, psychologists, and these are people who involved like at headquarters kind of planning thing, and some have very different views about, again, harkening back to the whole trauma pension debates, that they will personally espouse those views and have to me, but publicly not embrace that or disclose that, because that, you're right. I mean, there is kind of a political correctness right now that it would not bode well for anybody in the military to come out and say PTSD is not real, it's all due to weakness. I think they would be they would be whipped into submission or whatnot, or canceled or whatever, right? So there's enough of a uplift that PTSD is talked about in the military, and it's recognized generally in public. And a lot of the policies by the military has adopted certainly would say that the military believes that they're going to provide the best mental health care possible because they're obligated to, and that's what the wars have shown us. But yet what the wars have also shown us, and what we talk about in our book, is that time and again, as the new war begins, psychiatry's on the floor again. I mean, we're having to recreate, reinvent everything. All the policies, all the lessons learned about the legitimacy of war stress injury and what causes it will have to be relearned and rebattled again. If people really believe what you say they believe and hold mental health on par with physical health, as is publicly advocated in the military today, then you would see that level of preparation and resources that would back that up, and you don't.
I think that's what slows things down, because of money. I mean, it's going to cost more, and we have to change things a lot. I mean, remember when they were trying to combine medic school with what is the Marine Corps? I mean,
Purple suit?
What's that?
Was it purple suiting, where they were going to
Is that when
combine all the military?
Yeah. Have they done that?
No.
They were intending to do that.
They were intending to. It's personality driven. So the idea would be that they would save a lot of money in military medicine if they just had a military medical corps and not one for the Navy, one for the Army, and one for the Air Force.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of political pushback on that because people want to keep their territory and
tradition. All of the bullshit that one gets when you're in the military, and we're better than you are, and all that kind of thing. It's just ridiculous, especially when lives are at stake. And I don't understand how this could exist, really.
Well, I mean, a lot of studies have been done and financial analysis that would show that it would save a lot of money, taxpayer money, if they did have a purple suit military medicine instead of the individual services. As far as recruiting and training and retention and all that. But yeah, that's, again, what might sound good on paper or in public, there's always this pushback, maybe very subtle, not something maybe you would read about. No one's making a public declaration what not to do it, but just these ideas then lose the inertia and fade away. And they have to be re-picked up. You'll see another person will come along and they'll say, let's do the purple suit, and we'll see if that ever goes anywhere. But the same with mental health. It's driven by personalities. Some personalities, especially if they've been in combat and they know the realities of war, that they see through the fakeness of the trauma pension debates and the shallowness and the harm caused by perpetuating the stigma of mental health. And they're strong advocates, but then they leave the service.
Yes.
And then the memories of the war fade, and then you go back to baseline, which is one of neglecting mental health and under-resourcing it.
And this happens everywhere, unfortunately. Kathy would have told the story, her experience early on in our marriage. She got a contract to assist the Florida Highway Patrol. Okay. And she designed which you're processing information. Anyway, the patrol cars are in opposite directions, so they're able to talk to each other just across the way. So she had built what looked like car doors, so that you sit in a chair, and so it simulates somewhat, at least, what it would be like, what an experience.
Okay.
Everyone loved it. All the scores went in the right direction, etc. You're smiling, so you know what's happening. And the next person who was in that position, responsible for that position, said, we don't really need this. If we find problems, we'll come back to it. But, I don't think it's... And it was gone within a relatively short amount of time. I would say 8 months or something like that. It was just pathetic.
Yeah.
You must have been experiencing those sorts of things. all the time with
All the time.
reversals when a new person comes in.
Yeah, and essentially you describe what is the history of military mental health care. Is that it ebbs and flows. It gets its attention, during the heat of a war, and all the media attention and Congress gets involved, and they force the military to acknowledge the legitimacy and the necessity to deal with mental health dilemma and make it more of a priority, or at least an equal priority as the medical wounds of war. But then as the people, those leaders attrit and they retire, they leave the military, and or that the wars fade and the bullets stop flying, those programs very quickly dry up and are not replaced. They're deemed to be expendable. They start to whittle down the personnel, so you have fewer mental health providers on active duty, and things just start to go back to baseline, which is, as I said, one of neglect until the next war, which is about every 12 years or so. We have some major war, whatever that.
It reminds me of when Kathy and I attended, I think at the first or second Marine Corps birthday. And the Calm Down the Marine Corps came in, which is pretty good, but it's New Orleans, so a certain degree of attraction. And in checking with my colleagues and all that sort of thing, he presented it's like a president in which, well, my platform is, or here's what I'm going to be working on, etc. And that people were talking at the table saying, well, there goes that project, and oh, I guess we're not going to do that anymore. And it's pervasive. It happens all the time. Especially, you were describing how the military had to sort of pay attention, etc. But I think implied in your description was that they had their arms folded doing this. Like, okay, they were going to do it, but as soon as they had, well, let's get back to work and let's do it the right way,
I mean, you could, if you look at the whole chronology of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq from 2001, 2003, up until present day, and all the changes that have happened in regards to mental health, how we dealt with PTSD and, the suicide conferences and discussions and programs that you mentioned that you were involved in, or you talked to people involved with those, all the resources dedicated to it, all the changes in mental health policy have always come from outside the military. The military, as you had with your arms crossed across your chest, has always been dragged along like by the nose, and they'll do it because they're ordered to. And then as soon as the opportunity is that can be dropped, well, it's dropped, and often very quietly, very subtly. But yeah, you can tell where if the military was truly invested and truly believed and learned its war trauma lessons and believed in it, it says we're going to put mental health on par with physical health, and we're going to put action with policies, and we're not going to let it backslide anymore, and we're going to elevate mental health, and we're going to deal with stigma, and we're going to provide definitive care and treatment before people are discharged, and take care of families, and et cetera, all the things they say publicly, and it's in the policies that they would do. If they did it, we would be in a much different state when it comes to understanding and valuing mental health and dealing with stigma, both in the military, but in the private sector as well. If that ever comes to fruition, that was the whole, I think the big motivation for us to put this in writing this book and the articles that we've done, is that by making it public, at least it might give the future generations an opportunity to correct what we couldn't correct in our generation.
Oh, it has. I don't know how long it will last, but yeah, I think it has for sure.
We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Nothing else has worked. Maybe we'll try our fingers.
Yeah, why not? Well, what do you think? You think we beat this horse enough?
Yes. Poor horse.
You think we laid to rest the whole trauma pension debate that can now move on and say, yeah, it's not about predispositions. It really isn't. It's really more about, what people are exposed to and how that affects the human body, the mind, and the spirit. Yeah.
And to say it's relatively simple. It's not all that complicated in terms of war exposure trauma.
Yeah.
uh,
Well, yeah, that's the hope and that's the dream that we will get there, and that the whole trauma pension debates that will be put in relegated to history, and that people look back and say, man, people actually believe that stuff. They actually argued against the whole idea of holistic mental health is equal to physical health and what causes stress injuries, and that is it legitimate. So, maybe someday will be a history book that will look at this time and say, what were these people thinking? And
in the meantime,
yeah,
tune in.
tune in for the next.
Provide you with all the information that you would ever imagine wanting and needing.
And ready to be uplifted again for the
Yes.
future episodes. Look, again,
I know I've said this before, but it's always a pleasure and an honor, actually, to talk and work with you. Your knowledge of all of these things are boundless. I continue to be awestruck by this. I so appreciate you. Thank you, brother.
well, brother Charles, the feeling is absolutely mutual, and it's great to have you as a partner on this journey of ours.
Next month.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Right.